Hi everyone, thanks for joining me again today. I'm out doing some more landscape photography this morning at the beautiful Wallamba River here behind me, probably about 30 kilometres in from the ocean. So we're in rural land here at the moment. The idea today is to do some infrared photography. Now, a lot of people don't really know about infrared photography or understand it. Today I'm going to do a bit of a general overview on it and explain a little bit about it without getting too technical. I'll try and keep all my sort of lessons and tutorials and hints and tips and tricks all as basic and as understandable as possible. That way you're not spending time listening to too much information. You can actually get out there and put it into practice. So let's go. Alright, so you've heard about this thing called infrared photography and you're wondering what it is. So, in its most basic form, the human eye can see light, which is measured in nanometers. We can visually see between about 400 and 700 nanometers of light. So that's what gives us the lighting in our world as we see it. Infrared photography adds filters or modifies cameras so that we see only the light above about the 700 nanometers. So what does that do to our photos? It gives us probably a surreal, otherworldly, moody look to our photos, and that's great because you can add a bit of mood and sort of that moment to the photos that you wouldn't normally get when you're shooting in normal light. What else does infrared photography allow us to do? Well, we've all heard with normal landscape photography that you're out there in the golden hour, you're going to get the best light, around sunrise, sunset. With infrared photography, it gives you the opportunity, and it's probably the best conditions when the light is really at its brightest. So it gives us an opportunity to get out there in the middle of the day, bright light, and we can still grab some really moody, awesome photos. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of infrared photography? Well, one of the big advantages of infrared photography is you can get out there in the brightest of bright days and still get really good images in harsh light. Whereas if you're shooting just normal photography, that harsh light is going to be contrasty and not really give you the best shots. A lot of people are saying get out there in the golden hour or the blue hour, around sunrise and sunset. That's where you're going to get your best light normally. With infrared photography, you're getting your best light in the brightest light because that's where the most infrared rays are being generated. So that's one major advantage. Disadvantages. Of course there's a disadvantage. Yeah, I know. Bummer, eh? The disadvantages are you're going to need a tripod to shoot on, so you'll have to have a tripod with you because the filters are quite dark and you're going to have movement in your images if you don't have your camera on a tripod. The other disadvantage is you will have movement in trees and things like that because of the exposure times that you're needing to shoot. You're looking at 20-second, 30-second exposure times. In some cases, you can get shorter, but the longer exposures will mean you will have movement in trees and things like that in general. So there's a couple of advantages and disadvantages, but a big advantage is that you can get out in that harsh light and still capture some really awesome photos. So there's just a couple of other things to be aware of when you're shooting infrared photography, is that some lenses will tend to have a little more lens flare than they normally do, and that's because the coatings are done by the manufacturer to cope with lens flare in a normal light situation, and because we're shooting infrared, we're not really shooting with a normal light, so you might get a little more lens flare on your favourite lens. Now, the other thing to be aware of is that some lenses will have hot spots when you're shooting infrared. Now, there are numerous lists online that will identify a whole range of lenses and let you know if they've got hot spots or not when you're shooting infrared. So if you just do a Google search, infrared photography, hotspots for lenses, then you'll be able to see how compatible your particular lens is, or your favourite lens is, with infrared photography. So that's just a couple of things to be aware of. A, the lens flare might be a little bit more, and B, your favourite lens might have hotspots that appear when you're doing infrared photography. So something else to be aware of when you are shooting infrared photography, because you're shooting in the brightest part of the day, you're obviously going to have much more light, because the harsh light is really what I'm looking for when I'm shooting infrared photography, because the more light that's hitting subjects, the more I can pull out of that image. But because you're shooting in that harsh light, you may experience light leaks getting in and onto your image. Now, this can happen in a couple of ways. Usually it would be through your filter. It could be coming in through the sides, or you may not have your filter system mounted properly. It may not seal properly, so it could be coming in A, through your filter, or B, possibly even through your viewfinder if you're shooting a digital SLR camera. So you can fix up the viewfinder issue by, most cameras have a little cap that goes over the back and seals that off, and it's always best to check your filter system as well, just to make sure that everything's nice and sealed and snug, so that you're not going to get any light leaks coming in through there. Okay, so if I've got your curiosity up now about infrared photography, you're probably wondering what works well in infrared. Now, I've found from my experience, I really think trees work well, and I really think man-made structures such as buildings and bridges and things like that work really well in infrared photography. So there are a couple of things that I always look out for. Alright, so enough of me talking about infrared photography. I'm now going to set up and head down onto the boat ramp here behind me, and I'll try and get some photos of the trees on the other side of the riverbank, and also do a few shots down towards the river bend. I've got the Nikon with me. I've got a couple of infrared filters there. One is a 720 nanometer filter, and another one's a 850 nanometer. So they will give different effects. As always, I'll put the images up at the end of the video. Now, there's a couple of infrared photos I shot 2 days ago when I was 300 kilometers further north up the coast, and I'll put those ones on the end as well. So that'll give a broad range of different photos. So let's get into this and get this started. One thing to be aware of when you're first shooting infrared photography is that your autofocus is more than likely not going to work because the filter is so dark. So what I recommend, put your camera on the tripod, get your composition how you want it. While it's all in autofocus, get your focus set, and then flick back from autofocus to manual focus, and then put the infrared filter on, and then you can start shooting. Okay, so let's start with these photos. I'm going to spin this camera around so you can see what I'm looking at. Looking down the river, we'll shoot a few down towards the river bend, and then we'll shoot a few across the river. Currently just playing around with the ISO here, trying to get, I've got the shutter speed that I want, I've got the aperture I want, so I'm just adjusting the ISO to try and get the exposure that I want at the moment. Alright, I'm pretty happy with them. That's a couple that I've shot with the 720 nanometer filter. Going to change over to an 850, which is really going to darken everything right up. So I'm going to need to shoot this in bulb, which will be probably a few minutes of exposure time. So I'm just going to go up, back to the car, grab my remote shutter release so I can shoot in bulb setting, and then I'll get in and take a couple of really long exposures on this as well. I'm shooting the same scene with two different filters, so you'll be able to see in the end results what effect the different filters have on the final image. So like I said, there's a 720 and an 850 nanometer filter that I'm using today, and you'll be able to compare them in the end results. So I'm currently in the process of shooting a 10-minute exposure now with this 850 infrared filter. That'll be my last one on this composition that I've got here, and then I'll move a little further up the boat ramp and just take this scene straight across the river here. Because I like the way the light hits those trees, and I think that'll be good for infrared. So I've got a couple more minutes to go on this exposure here. Like I said, this 850 is really a dark filter, so it does make for long exposure times. Finish this one, and then I'll recompose, and we'll get this scene behind me here. Some beautiful birds and wildlife singing in the background here too. I don't know if the sound is picking that up, but yeah, I'm really going to come back here and do a couple of sound recordings and get a bit of wildlife photography, because the birds are quite active on this river here. For those curious, this river here that I'm shooting is the Wallamba River. The township is called Nabiac. It's about 30 kilometres, as I mentioned earlier, inland from the coast. It's a lovely spot, very rural, very regional. Temperature today at the moment is about 18 degrees, and it was quite cool when I headed out earlier this morning. It was around probably 8 degrees. So it is warming up, there's no breeze, so it's good photography conditions. So let's recompose this and get the shot across the river now. So I've recomposed here, different composition. Just had to readjust the autofocus. Like I said before, autofocus first, get your composition, and then worry about putting the filter on last. That way, because you're not going to see through that dark filter to be able to do anything otherwise. So at the moment I'm just shooting a 1 minute exposure at ISO 800 at f4 on this 850 nanometer filter. The light's changing a little bit. The sun's dropping behind the clouds that are to the north of me, so we'll see how we go, what sort of exposures we're getting here. Alright, I've finished up my infrared photography down on the boat ramp. Going to get all this gear packed away, head on home, pop these images across to the computer and have a look how they turned out. I hope this video has helped you get a bit of an insight into infrared photography, and it may or may not be something that you want to get into. If you have any questions or comments, just leave them in the comments down below. I'm always replying, so again, any questions, just leave them down below. If you like what you're seeing, give me a thumbs up. It really helps me out. Even better, hit the subscribe button. That way you won't miss any of my latest videos. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.